Hello everyone, I'm Officer Cedric Loxley. Today, I want to tell you about something that happened to me while working as a police officer. It was late October, the kind of autumn where the cold doesn't just sit in the air, it gets right into your bones the minute the sun goes down. I was working the graveyard shift in District 4, a sprawling sector that covers everything from fading industrial parks to old, tightly packed residential neighborhoods where the houses have been leaning against each other for 80 years. It was about 2:30 in the morning. The radio had been mostly quiet for an hour, save for the occasional crackle of dispatch sending a unit to a false commercial alarm or a minor domestic dispute across town. My partner that night was Marcus Vance. Marcus was younger than me by about 8 years, but he'd been on the force long enough to know when to talk and when to keep his eyes on the mirrors. We were parked in the gravel lot of an abandoned textile mill, the cruiser's engine idling low to keep the heater running. I was staring out at the rusted chain-link fence, watching the dead leaves whip across the asphalt in the headlights, when the radio finally chirped with our call sign. Dispatch came through with a monotone cadence that always signifies a routine check, but often precedes the worst nights of your career. They reported a suspicious vehicle parked at the end of Blackwood Lane. According to the caller, a resident who refused to leave their name, the car had been sitting at the dead end for over 3 hours with its parking lights on. The caller thought they saw someone sitting in the driver's seat, motionless. Blackwood Lane wasn't a place people just wandered into. It was a narrow, poorly paved road that ran parallel to the old municipal reservoir, ending at a turnaround right against the dense woods of the state park. There were only 4 houses on the entire lane, all of them set back behind deep front yards and thick rows of pine trees. I put the cruiser in drive and Marcus started looking up the property records for that end of the lane on the mobile data terminal. As we rolled out of the gravel lot, the tires crunched loudly against the stones. The drive took us about 7 minutes. The further we got from the main commercial strip, the darker the world became. The streetlights in District 4 are notoriously unreliable, but out near the reservoir they simply didn't exist. We turned onto Blackwood Lane, and the canopy of overgrown oak branches immediately cut off what little ambient light the night sky provided. Our headlights cut through the gloom, reflecting off the damp leaves on the asphalt. As we neared the end of the road, the houses disappeared behind us. The pavement gave way to broken gravel and dirt. And then, right where the road terminated at a pair of rotting wooden barricades, we saw it. It was an older model sedan, dark blue or black, parked at an awkward angle. It wasn't lined up with the turnaround. It looked like the driver had pulled up hard against the brush and just cut the engine. The parking lights were indeed on, casting a faint amber glow on the dry brush directly in front of the bumper. I pulled our cruiser up about 15 feet behind the vehicle, angling the nose slightly to the left so our spotlight would hit the driver's side mirror and illuminate the interior without blinding us if someone looked back. I toggled the spotlight joystick, sweeping the bright white beam across the rear window of the sedan. The glass was heavily fogged from the inside. That's always a specific indicator. It means someone is inside, breathing, generating heat in a cold car. Marcus ran the license plate before we even unbuckled our seatbelts. The system was slow, spinning for a few long seconds before throwing back a hit. The vehicle was registered to an elderly woman named Martha Vance, no relation to Marcus, living 3 towns over. There were no active warrants attached to the plate, no reports of the vehicle being stolen, and no history of police contact with that specific registration. I looked over at Marcus. I told him we'd approach standard double side, him on the passenger side, me on the driver's side. I reminded him to keep his flashlight low, aiming for the side mirrors to disrupt the driver's vision if they decided to get hostile, but mostly to look for movement inside the cabin. We opened our doors, the hinges giving a familiar, heavy click. The cold air hit my face instantly, smelling of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp scent of unburned fuel coming from the sedan's exhaust pipe. The car had been running recently, even if the engine was off now. We moved forward in tandem, our boots making almost no sound on the wet gravel. My left hand rested naturally on the butt of my sidearm, a habit born from years of doing this, while my right hand held the heavy tactical flashlight against my chest. As I closed the distance to the rear bumper, I tapped the trunk lid with my thumb, a standard procedure to ensure it was latched, and to leave my prints on the vehicle just in case. When I reached the driver's side rear window, I stopped and shined my light inside. The condensation on the glass made it difficult to see clearly, but I could make out the silhouette of a single occupant in the driver's seat. The head was tilted back against the headrest, completely still. I moved up to the B-pillar, right behind the driver's shoulder, which is the safest position because it forces them to turn around completely to see you. I knocked hard on the glass with my flashlight. The sharp metallic sound echoed in the quiet night. The occupant didn't flinch. They didn't jump or look toward the window. Slowly, the head rolled to the left, facing me. It was a man, probably in his late 20s or early 30s. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly through the fogged glass. His face was extraordinarily pale, his mouth slightly agape. For a second, a cold spike went through my chest, because he looked exactly like a corpse. But then, his chest rose with a ragged, heavy gasp, and his eyes blinked twice, slowly, as if he were trying to wake up from a deep sedation. I commanded him to roll down the window. He didn't move his arms. He just kept staring at me, his breathing shallow now. I knocked again, harder this time, the vibration shaking the door frame. I yelled through the glass, telling him to show me his hands. On the other side of the car, I could see the faint glow of Marcus's flashlight illuminating the passenger side. Marcus gave me a quick nod through the front windshield, signaling that the passenger area was clear of weapons from what he could see. The driver finally made a movement. His right hand rose slowly from his lap, not toward the steering wheel or the ignition, but toward the window crank. It was an old car with manual windows. He turned it half an inch at a time, his movements incredibly sluggish, as if he were underwater. As the window cracked open about 2 inches, a wave of air escaped from the interior. It didn't smell like alcohol. It didn't smell like marijuana or the chemical tang of methamphetamine. It smelled like old copper, sour sweat, and something distinctly metallic that I couldn't immediately place. I asked him if he was all right, if he knew where he was. The man looked at me, his pupils dilated to the point where the irises were barely visible. He tried to speak, but only a dry click came from his throat. He swallowed hard, cleared his throat, and whispered a single sentence that changed the entire nature of the stop. He said, "I couldn't stop him." I immediately asked him who he was talking about and who he was. I reached for the door handle from the outside, testing it. It was unlocked. I opened the door slowly, keeping my body angled behind the frame for protection. The interior light of the sedan flickered on, a dim yellow bulb that revealed the true state of the vehicle. There was blood on the center console. Not a small droplet, but a smeared, dark smear that had begun to dry around the edges. I ordered the man to place his hands on the steering wheel where I could see them. He complied, but his limbs were shaking violently now, a delayed reaction to whatever shock or substance was coursing through his system. I asked Marcus to step around to my side to assist with removing the driver while keeping security on the vehicle. I grabbed the man's left wrist. His skin was ice cold and clammy. I guided him out of the vehicle. His legs buckled slightly as his boots hit the gravel, and I caught his weight, leaning him against the rear quarter panel of his car. Marcus immediately began a pat-down for weapons, finding nothing but a wallet in his back pocket and a ring of keys. I took the wallet from Marcus and opened it under my flashlight. The driver's license belonged to a David Vance, matching the last name of the registered owner. The address listed was the same one from the registration, 3 towns over. David was 29 years old. "David," I said, leaning in close so he could hear me over the wind rustling the trees. "Who did you fail to stop? What happened here?" David looked past me, his eyes focusing on the dense woods at the end of the road. His arm raised slowly, pointing a trembling finger toward the tree line where the wooden barricades were rotting away. "The man from the highway," he muttered. "He went into the trees. He told me if I got out of the car, he'd find me. He took the keys. I only had the spare to turn on the lights." Marcus looked up from his notepad, his expression hardening. We both knew there wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. The state park property began right behind those barricades, consisting of hundreds of acres of protected timberland, steep ridges, and old, disused water management structures from the early 20th century. I radioed dispatch immediately. I requested a secondary unit to our location for assistance and called for an ambulance, stating we had a male subject suffering from severe shock, potential exposure, and possible involvement in a violent incident, noting the blood inside the vehicle. Dispatch acknowledged, their tone completely changing now that a routine check had turned into something substantial. They informed us that the closest backup unit was about 12 minutes away, as they were handling an active burglary call on the south side of the city. 12 minutes is an eternity when you're standing at the edge of a dark forest with a bleeding car and a rambling witness. I turned back to David. I needed to establish where the blood came from. I pulled up his sleeves and checked his hands. He had minor abrasions on his knuckles, but no major lacerations that could account for the volume of blood on the center console. I opened the driver's side door wider and shined my light into the footwell. There, on the passenger seat floorboard, was a discarded roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a small silver pocket knife, unopened. "David, whose blood is that in the car?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm, using the tone you use when you need someone to snap out of their panic. David looked down at his own shoes, then back at the woods. "It's from the fight," he whispered, "at the rest stop on Route 9. He hit me. He hit me hard against the doorframe before he made me drive. That's my blood." I reached out and gently tipped his chin up, examining his face under the beam of my flashlight. There was no swelling on his jaw, no split lip, no cuts on his forehead or near his hairline. The blood on the console was substantial, far too much to have come from the minor scrapes on his knuckles, which were already scabbed over. A cold feeling of distrust began to form in my stomach. David was lying about where the blood came from. If he wasn't bleeding, who was? My mind began to spiral into a deeper sense of unease. Was David actually a victim here? Or was he a deeply disturbed individual who had committed a crime elsewhere and driven to this isolated spot to hide or unravel? His dilated pupils, his freezing skin, his disjointed sentences, it all pointed towards someone experiencing profound psychological distress. But whether that distress was caused by being a victim of a carjacking or the sudden realization of a horrific act he had committed himself remained entirely unclear. I looked at the dark smear on the console again. It was a transfer stain, meaning something heavily covered in blood had pressed hard against the plastic. "Marcus," I called out softly, stepping away from David so my voice wouldn't carry over the rustling leaves. "Take a look at his face. He says he was beaten up at a rest stop. I don't see a single mark on him." Marcus stepped closer, squinting in the dark. He shone his light directly into David's eyes. David flinched, pulling his head back against the car body. "I'm telling the truth," David insisted, his voice rising in pitch, sounding thinner, more frantic. "He had a gun. He forced his way into my passenger seat at the mobile station. He made me drive out here. He said he had business in the woods. When the car started dying, he grabbed his bag and ran. I don't know who he is. You have to go after him before he comes back for me." "Why didn't you drive to a police station, David?" I asked, keeping my tone leveled, testing his logic. "You drove past 2 well-lit intersections on the highway to get here. You passed a fire station. Why did you come all the way down a dead-end lane into a dark forest?" "Because he was pointing the gun at my side the whole time," David shouted, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep them raised. "He told me if I turned the wheel toward the light, he'd kill me right there. He kept talking about a debt. He kept saying it had to happen where nobody could look. You have to believe me." The mention of a debt threw another wrench into my understanding of the situation. Was this a drug deal gone wrong? A targeted retaliation? If David was involved in something illegal, it would explain why he didn't seek out the police, but it also meant he was far from an innocent bystander. He might be trying to protect himself by inventing a ghostly, nameless gunman who had conveniently vanished into thin air. Marcus walked over to the front of the sedan, lowering his flashlight to the ground near the front bumper. "Cedric!" he called out, his tone flat, cautious, and drained of any warmth. "You need to see this." I left David leaning against the rear quarter panel, ensuring he was secure under my eye, and joined Marcus at the front bumper. The ground here was soft, a mixture of wet mud, clay, and decaying leaves. In the beam of Marcus's light, 2 distinct sets of footprints were visible, leading away from the passenger side of the vehicle directly toward the gap in the wooden barricades. One set was made by heavy, lugged boots, likely a work boot. The other set was much smaller, shallow, made by what appeared to be flat-soled shoes or sneakers. The smaller footprints were highly irregular. One foot seemed to drag heavily along the ground, leaving a continuous winding groove in the mud. Beside the tracks, there were several dark droplets on the fallen leaves. I knelt down, touching one with the tip of my gloved finger. It was wet. It was fresh blood. 2 sets, Marcus murmured, his eyes tracking the line into the dark brush where the trees closed in like teeth. "If a guy forced David to drive here and then ran off alone, Why are there two sets of tracks leaving the passenger side? And why is one person dragging their foot? I looked back at David. He was watching us intently from the rear of the car, his face illuminated by our cruiser's parking lights. He looked small, terrified, but there was a strange intensity in his stare that made me deeply uncomfortable. Was he watching to see if we fell for his trap? "David!" I called out, walking back toward him. "Who else was in that car with you? There are two sets of footprints leading into the woods. One of them is small. Who belongs to those shoes?" David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving convulsively. He looked down at the mud, then back up at me, his eyes wide and glossy. "I don't know," he whispered. "I swear to God, I don't know. Maybe he was carrying someone? Or maybe someone was already waiting for him out here." He kept talking to himself the whole drive. He kept saying, "She's going to be there. She has to be there." I thought he was crazy. I didn't look in the back seat, Cedric. I was too scared to look behind me. The story was changing again, shifting under our feet like loose sand. First, he was alone with a gunman. Then it was a dispute about a debt. Now, there was a mention of a she waiting in the dark forest, or perhaps an unconscious passenger hidden in the rear footwell that David claimed he never noticed. Every time we pushed for a direct answer, the narrative twisted, leaving us with more questions than we started with. Was David a victim of a carjacking, or was he an accomplice who had helped transport someone into these woods? Or worse, was he a deeply unhinged man who had committed a horrific act alone, and his mind was now fracturing, projecting his own guilt onto a fictional suspect? The discrepancies were piling up, and every single one of them pointed toward a violent event that was actively unfolding in the dark behind those barricades. But the true shape of that event remained entirely invisible to us. We couldn't wait 12 minutes for backup. The sheer volume of fresh blood on the ground combined with the dragging footprints meant that someone was severely injured out there, moving deeper into a wilderness where the temperature was dropping toward freezing. If we stood by our cruiser waiting for additional units, whoever was bleeding out in those woods might not survive the night. I looked at Marcus. "We aren't waiting." Marcus didn't hesitate. He reached into the cruiser, grabbed our long-range patrol rifle from the rack between the seats, a standard AR-15 platform, and checked the chamber with a crisp, metallic clack. He slung it over his shoulder while I secured David in the back seat of our cruiser. I locked the door, leaving the window cracked slightly so he could breathe, and told him to stay low. He didn't protest. He just sat there, staring out the glass with those dinner plate pupils, his forehead pressed against the cold window pane, watching us leave him behind. I adjusted my utility belt, ensuring my radio was turned up to maximum volume but toggled to the earpiece speaker so it wouldn't betray our position in the woods. I drew my service weapon, a Glock 17, and held it in a low, ready position. Marcus took the lead with the rifle, his weapon light offering a wider, more powerful beam than our standard flashlights. We stepped over the rotting timber of the barricade and entered the state park. The transition from the road to the woods was immediate and oppressive. The wind, which had been whipping across the open turnaround, died down, replaced by the dense, muffled stillness of the forest. The only sounds were the crunch of our own boots on the leaf litter and the distant rhythmic hum of the city's water treatment plant across the reservoir. The trail wasn't a maintained hiking path. It was an old fire road, long overgrown with saplings and briars that tore at our uniform trousers. The mud here preserved the tracks perfectly. The heavy boot prints were deep, indicating the suspect was carrying or supporting significant weight. The smaller tracks continued to drag, the intervals between them becoming uneven, suggesting the second person was losing their ability to walk or was actively resisting. But as we moved deeper, the environment began to feel distinctly unsettling. The air felt heavier, thicker, carrying a scent that didn't belong in a normal forest. It was a faint chemical smell, like kerosene mixed with old grease. It made my throat dry. About 50 yards in, Marcus suddenly stopped. He clicked off his weapon light with a soft click. I followed suit, plunging us into total darkness. "Did you hear that?" Marcus whispered, his head tilted toward the right side of the trail. I listened, holding my breath, my chest tight against my vest. For a long 10 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my own pulse thumping in my ears. Then, from the darkness further up the ridge, came a sound like metal scraping against stone, a dull rhythmic clink, clink, clink. It didn't sound like an animal moving through the brush. It sounded like someone deliberately tapping a tool against a rock, testing its weight or signaling. "David said the guy ran," I whispered to Marcus, my lips barely moving. But that sound isn't someone running. That's someone waiting for us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A familiar instinct, a gut feeling honed over 15 years on the streets, told me that we were being watched. It wasn't a logical thought. It was a physical sensation, a cold pressure between my shoulder blades. The woods felt hostile, as if the trees themselves were closing in around the narrow fire road to trap us, cutting off our line of sight and our connection to the world outside. "We keep moving," Marcus whispered, his voice steady but low. "But we watch the flanks. Something feels wrong about this, Cedric. If David was running a play on us, whoever is up there is part of it." We turned our lights back on, the bright beams cutting through the dark like silver blades, revealing millions of floating dust motes and the twisted shapes of old oak trees. We continued forward, but our pace was slower now, our boots lifting high to avoid rustling the dry leaves, our eyes constantly scanning the thickets on either side of the trail. About 100 yards deeper into the forest, we hit our first major dead end. The dragging footprints and the heavy boot prints suddenly veered off the old fire road, leading directly into a dense, thorny patch of wild blackberry bushes. The briars were thick, interwoven like barbed wire, standing 6 feet high. It looked completely impassable. Marcus shone his light directly into the center of the thicket. "Look at the branches," he said. "They aren't broken. If someone forced their way through here carrying a body, these thorns would be stripped bare. The tracks just stop right at the edge." I knelt down, bringing my light close to the mud. The footprints were there, clear as day, pointing directly into the thorns. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The mud inside the footprints was dry around the rims. The tracks we had been following weren't fresh from 20 minutes ago. They had been made hours earlier, perhaps even during the day when the ground was still soft from the morning rain. "Marcus," I whispered, a cold sweat breaking out under my uniform shirt. "These aren't the tracks of a man who just ran from the car. These tracks have been here for hours. David told us the guy ran into the woods right before we arrived." "Then what the hell did David do?" Marcus muttered, his hand tightening on the grip of his rifle. "If he's been sitting in that car for 3 hours like the caller said, and these tracks are old, who was he waiting for? Or did he make these tracks himself earlier, walked back to his car, and sat there until someone called us?" The theory that David was a victim began to completely unravel in my mind. The timeline didn't work. If David had been carjacked 20 minutes ago, these dry-rimmed tracks couldn't belong to his attacker. It felt like we were following a scripted path, a trail laid out specifically to lure us away from the road and deep into the darkness of the state park. We stood there in the absolute quiet, the weight of our isolation pressing down on us. The radio in my ear was silent, the deep ridges of the park cutting off the ambient transmissions from the city. We were completely on our own. "Let's cast out," I said, trying to regain control of the scene. "Check the surrounding ground. He couldn't have jumped over a 6-foot briar patch. There has to be another set of prints." We began to circle the thicket, sweeping our lights in wide arcs. The forest seemed to swallow the light, the black ground absorbing the beams. After 5 minutes of searching through the dense brush, Marcus called out from a small clearing about 30 yards to the left. "Cedric, over here. I found something else, and it makes even less sense." I hurried over, my boots sinking into the soft moss. Marcus was standing over a rotting log that had fallen across a small creek bed. Resting on top of the moss-covered wood was a discarded object, a pair of heavy rubber gloves covered in a sticky yellowish grease, and a rusted iron chain about 4 feet long coiled neatly like a sleeping snake. I knelt down, examining the chain. It wasn't old debris left by loggers. The rust was surface level, and the links were completely free of leaves or dirt. Someone had placed it here recently, deliberately coiling it on the log. "What is this, a staging area?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning the dark trees above the creek. "A chain, gloves, duct tape in the car. This looks like a premeditated abduction, Cedric. But where are they?" "Look at the ground across the creek," I said, pointing my light at the opposite bank. There were no boot prints. There were no dragging tracks. Instead, there were several deep circular depressions in the mud, spaced about 2 feet apart. They looked like the marks left by a heavy tripod or a set of wooden posts. Beside the depressions lay a small, broken piece of green plastic, a fragment of a modern tarpaulin. The clues were conflicting, leading us in circles. Was there a camp out here? A construction site? A hidden manufacturing operation? The presence of the chain and the grease suggested industrial activity, but the newspaper clippings and the blood pointed towards something far more sinister. The worst part was that none of it aligned with David's story about a panicked gunman running blindly into the woods. David was either completely insane, or he was part of something so large and organized that Marcus and I were completely out of our depth. "Cedric," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Listen." I cut my light. The forest went black again. From the ridge above the creek bed, about 40 yards away, came the distinct sound of footsteps, but they weren't the heavy, frantic footsteps of a fleeing suspect. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. Someone was walking parallel to us, matching our movements, staying just outside the range of our flashlights. "He's watching us," I whispered, my hand moving to my holster to ensure my weapon was clear. "He's been watching us since we left the road. Do we call for a perimeter?" Marcus asked. "If there's more than one of them out here, we're walking right into a pocket." "Radio's dead down in this draw," I said, tapping my earpiece. There was nothing but low, white, static hum. "We can't get a signal out until we clear this ridge. We keep moving, but we move toward the high ground. Don't let him get above us." We crossed the creek bed, our boots splashing into the cold water, and began a steep, grueling climb up the opposite bank. The incline was brutal, covered in loose shale and sliding dirt that made every step a physical battle. My lungs burned, and the heavy ballistic vest felt like a lead weight dragging my chest down. As we neared the top of the ridge, the strange chemical smell grew stronger, filling my nose with the scent of unrefined fuel and damp iron. And then the trees abruptly ended. We broke through a thicket of wild berry bushes into a large, artificial clearing that felt completely disconnected from the rest of the forest. The ground was flat, covered in crushed gravel that had long since been overtaken by weeds and low ferns. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, imposing structure that didn't appear on any modern municipal map. It was an old stone pump house built during the construction of the reservoir back in the 1920s and abandoned to the elements decades ago. The walls were constructed from huge, rough-cut granite blocks covered in thick ivy and green moss that looked black in the darkness. The roof had partially collapsed, with several massive wooden beams angling down into the interior like the broken ribs of a buried beast. In front of the pump house, someone had built a small fire inside a circle of rough stones. The fire was active, fed by thick logs of dry pine, sending a steady stream of gray smoke up into the cold night air. The orange flames flickered against the stone walls, creating long, dancing shadows that shifted and stretched across the clearing. Beside the fire sat a large, rusted metal cylinder rising about 3 feet from the ground. The old wellhead or access shaft for the water system. The heavy iron cover that normally sealed it was slid halfway off, leaving a dark, crescent-shaped opening that led straight down into the depths of the earth. The clearing was dead quiet save for the crackle of the burning pine wood. The sense of dread here was physical, a thick pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Marcus," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark entrance of the pump house. "This is what David was talking about, the cabin, the well. He wasn't lying about the location. But he lied about everything else," Marcus said, his rifle raised to his shoulder, his light sweeping the dark perimeter of the clearing. "Look at the fire. That's a sustainable fire. Someone's been here for days, Cedric. This isn't a hiding spot for a guy who just ran from a carjacking 20 minutes ago." We split up, using our standard tactical approach, but every movement felt slow, heavy, as if we were moving through water. Marcus moved left around the pile of old concrete pipes, his rifle light checking the blind spots. I moved right, my Glock leveled at the entrance of the stone pump house, which was nothing more than a dark, gaping void where a wooden door had long since rotted away. I reached the corner of the granite blocks. The stone was ice cold against my shoulder. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the shaking in my hands. Not from the cold, but from the overwhelming feeling that I was stepping into a slaughterhouse. I pivoted around the doorframe, stepping into the interior of the pump house, my flashlight instantly clicking on to flood the room with white light. The beam cut through decades of dust, spiderwebs, and decay. The floor was covered in shattered clay tiles, rusted iron pipes, and piles of old plaster. But as my light swept the room, my heart stopped. The interior was a meticulously maintained living space for a monster. In the far corner, a modern heavy-duty sleeping bag was spread out over a neat layer of dry straw. Beside it were several empty canned food items, a portable propane heater, and a small wooden crate that served as a table. On top of the crate sat a stack of notebook pages covered in tight, frantic handwriting. I stepped closer, keeping my weapon raised toward the dark corners of the collapsed roof, and shone my light on the papers. The writing was chaotic, filled with repeated phrases, names crossed out with heavy black ink, and crude drawings of the forest trails. One name was written larger than the others, circled multiple times until the paper was torn. Clara. Beside the notebook lay a small leather-bound photo album. I reached out with my gloved hand, flipping it open. The first page contained a photograph of a young woman with brown hair, smiling in front of a college dorm building. The second page had the same photograph, but her face had been carefully scratched out with a knife or a pin, leaving only a white, torn void where her features should be. The next few pages were filled with clippings from local newspapers, reports of missing persons, articles about unsolved disappearances from 3 towns over, but it was the last page that made my blood run completely cold. It was a Polaroid photograph, fresh and glossy. It showed our police cruiser parked in the gravel lot of the abandoned textile mill, the exact spot where Marcus and I had been sitting just an hour ago. The photograph had been taken from the wood line, looking through our windshield. We hadn't found this place by accident. We had been watched from the very beginning of our shift. The caller who refused to leave their name, the car parked at the end of the road, David's shifting stories. It was all part of a grand design to bring us to this clearing. "Marcus!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic as I spun around toward the exit. "Get out of the clearing! It's a setup! He's been tracking us!" Before the words could fully clear my lips, a sharp metallic screech rang out from the clearing outside. I burst through the doorframe, my boots skidding on the gravel. The sound had come from the wellhead. Marcus was already moving toward it, his rifle light focused on the heavy iron cover. The cover was sliding further open, moving with a slow, grinding sound as if someone from inside the shaft was pushing it away from the rim with immense force. We closed the distance, our weapons trained on the opening, our breath rising in thick white plumes in the cold air. A hand appeared over the rim of the rusted metal cylinder. It was a man's hand, large, dirty, with thick grease under the fingernails, the same grease we had seen on the rubber gloves down by the creek. He was pulling himself up from the depths of the shaft, his knuckles white against the dark iron. "Police! Don't move! Show me your hands!" I shouted, the command tearing through the quiet clearing, carrying all the fear and rage I had been suppressing for the last hour. The man didn't stop. He heaved himself upward, his broad shoulders clearing the rim. He was a large individual, easily 6'2", wearing a stained canvas work jacket and heavy insulated trousers. His face was smudged with soot and dirt, his hair wild and matted. His eyes were small, deep-set, and filled with a frantic, desperate energy that didn't look like fear. It looked like pure, unadulterated rage. In his right hand, he was holding a heavy, rusty iron crowbar about 2 feet long, its sharp edge glinting in our flashlight beams. "Get down on the ground! Drop the iron! Drop it now!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking with the intensity of the moment. He had the rifle sight aligned right on the center of the man's chest. The suspect didn't drop the weapon. Instead, he swung his leg over the lip of the well, stepping onto the muddy ground. He didn't say a word. He just let out a low, animalistic growl, raised the crowbar above his shoulder, and took a wide, aggressive step directly toward Marcus. In that fraction of a second, the training takes over. You don't think about the paperwork. You don't think about the danger. You just react to the threat to your partner's life. Marcus fired a single round. The report of the rifle was deafening in the small clearing, a sharp, cracking boom that echoed off the stone walls of the pump house and rolled down the ridge like thunder. The suspect gasped, his momentum instantly stopping. The crowbar flew from his hand, clattering loudly against the iron well head before spinning into the mud. He stumbled back, his boots slipping in the wet leaves, and collapsed heavily against the side of the metal cylinder, sliding down until he was sitting upright, his head drooping toward his chest. The round had hit him in the right shoulder, effectively neutralizing his ability to swing the weapon. I immediately moved in, keeping my distance from his feet, and kicked the crowbar further away into the brush. Marcus kept his rifle trained on the suspect while I transitioned my weapon to my left hand and drew my handcuffs with my right. I grabbed the suspect's uninjured arm, pulled it behind his back, and secured the first cuff, then carefully brought his injured arm back to complete the lock. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, but he didn't offer any further resistance. "Where is she?" I demanded, kneeling beside him, my face inches from his dirty cheek. "Where is Clara?" The suspect didn't answer. He just let out a wet, rattling breath and closed his eyes, his head leaning back against the cold iron of the well with a faint, mocking smile on his lips. Marcus didn't wait for the suspect to talk. He slung his rifle and ran to the edge of the wellhead, shining his light directly into the dark opening. "Cedric, get over here, quick!" I stood up, leaving the suspect secured on the ground, and joined Marcus at the rim. The shaft was wide, about 4 feet across, lined with slimy green bricks that disappeared down into the darkness. About 12 feet down, the vertical shaft terminated at a concrete platform where the old water valves were located. Lying on that cold concrete platform, crumpled into a small ball, was the young woman from the photograph. She was wearing a torn blue denim jacket and dark trousers. Her eyes were closed, and her face was partially obscured by her matted brown hair. She wasn't moving. "Miss, can you hear me?" I shouted down into the hole. There was no response. The air coming out of the shaft was incredibly cold, smelling of stale water, damp earth, and that distinct metallic tang. I looked around the clearing for a way down. There was an old iron ladder built into the side of the brick wall, but many of the rungs were completely rusted through, leaving only jagged nubs sticking out from the masonry. It was too dangerous to attempt a standard climb down without a rope, but we didn't have a rope, and we didn't know if she was dying down there. I looked at Marcus. "Keep eyes on him. If he moves, you let me know." I unbuckled my utility belt, stripping off the heavy leather that held my radio, extra magazines, and handcuffs, leaving only my trouser belt and my pocket flashlight. I didn't want the extra weight or bulk catching on the narrow walls of the shaft. I climbed over the rusted metal rim, my boots finding the first iron rung. It groaned under my weight but held. I began to descend, moving 1 foot at a time, testing each rung before transferring my full weight. The walls were slick with algae, and cold water dripped from the ceiling above, hitting my neck and sliding down my back. About halfway down, my boot pressed onto a rung that instantly snapped with a sharp crack, falling into the darkness below. My hands gripped the upper rung hard, the rough iron cutting into my palms through my tactical gloves. I dangled for a second, my heart in my throat, before swinging my leg out to find a footwell in the brickwork itself. I managed to lower myself the remaining distance, my boots hitting the concrete platform with a dull thud. The air down here was tight, heavy, suffocating. I knelt down beside the young woman, gently turning her onto her back while being careful of her neck and spine. She was young, maybe 22 or 23. There was a large, swelling bruise on her right temple where she had been struck, and her face was covered in dirt and dried blood from a small laceration near her hairline. I pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, I felt nothing. My own blood was roaring in my ears so loudly I couldn't concentrate. I moved my fingers slightly, pressing deeper against the carotid artery. There it was, a thready, rapid, but distinct pulse. She was alive. "Miss, my name is Cedric. I'm a police officer. You're safe now," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. Her eyelids fluttered. She let out a weak groan, her hand moving slightly toward her stomach. He wouldn't let me go," she whispered, her voice barely audible, raw from screaming or crying. "He said nobody would find us here." "He's caught, miss. He can't hurt you anymore," I assured her, taking her cold hand in mine to offer some warmth. I looked up toward the opening. Marcus's silhouette was visible against the night sky, his flashlight pointing down to illuminate the platform. "Marcus!" I shouted. "She's alive! We need that ambulance here right now, and tell them they need a technical rescue team with a basket and ropes to get her out of here. I can't carry her up this ladder." "Copy that!" Marcus yelled back. I heard him immediately keying his mic, his voice urgent as he relayed the update to dispatch. The radio traffic was busy now, with multiple units from neighboring jurisdictions responding to our location after hearing the report of shots fired. Down in the shaft, the minutes stretched out like hours. I stayed with Clara, using my uniform jacket to cover her, trying to keep her shivering under control. She remained semi-conscious, drifting in and out, occasionally mumbling about a truck stop and a dark road. I kept talking to her, telling her about my family, about the weather, about anything just to keep her focused and awake. Above us, the woods eventually came alive with the sound of distant sirens. The wails grew louder, echoing through the ridges until they suddenly cut off at the end of Blackwood Lane. A few minutes later, I heard the heavy crash of footsteps through the brush surrounding the clearing. Flashlights swept across the top of the wellhead, and several voices began calling out orders. The backup units had arrived, followed closely by the fire department's heavy rescue squad. A firefighter equipped with a full climbing harness and a specialized rescue basket was lowered down into the shaft. He was professional, moving with a calm efficiency that immediately lowered the tension in the hole. Together, we carefully lifted Clara into the basket, securing her with heavy straps to ensure she wouldn't shift during the ascent. I watched as the basket was slowly hoisted up into the light, Clara's hand sticking out from under the blankets, holding onto the edge. Once she was clear, the firefighter lowered the harness back down for me. I clipped myself in and was pulled out of the dark, slimy shaft, my boots finally touching the solid ground of the clearing. The scene above was chaotic but orderly. There were at least 8 police cruisers parked back at the turnaround, their red and blue lights reflecting off the trees like a twisted disco. In the clearing, paramedics were treating the suspect, who was now strapped to a gurney, his shoulder heavily bandaged. He was being wheeled toward the trail, still silent, his eyes fixed on the sky. Marcus walked over to me, handing me my utility belt. He looked exhausted, his face smudged with dirt and sweat. "You all right?" he asked, throwing a hand on my shoulder. "Yeah," I said, buckling the leather belt back around my waist. "Palms are a little scraped up, but I'll survive. How's the car?" "David's still in the back," Marcus said. The secondary units took his statement. Turns out he was telling the truth about the carjacking, even if he panicked and lied about the blood at first. The suspect, whose name is Thomas Vance, no relation to me either, strange coincidence, had jumped David at a rest area on the highway, forced his way into the car, and held a knife to David's side while he drove. David managed to intentionally stall the car at the end of Blackwood Lane, knowing it was a dead end, hoping the guy would run. He didn't think the guy would take the girl with him. We walked back down the ridge together, following the path illuminated by the fire department's portable light towers. The trek down was much easier than the climb up, the adrenaline finally washing out of my system, leaving a heavy, profound fatigue in its place. When we reached the turnaround at Blackwood Lane, the area was blocked off with yellow crime scene tape. Clara was already inside the ambulance, the doors closing as it began to slowly navigate the narrow gravel road back toward the main highway. The investigation that followed took months. It turned out Thomas Vance was a deeply disturbed individual who had been living in that abandoned pump house for over 3 months, completely off the grid. He had abducted Clara from a convenience store parking lot 2 counties over, and if it hadn't been for David's broken-down car and the resident who noticed the suspicious vehicle on Blackwood Lane, we might never have found that clearing. David Vance was cleared of any wrongdoing. His actions at the end of the road likely saved Clara's life by forcing the suspect into a situation where he couldn't easily escape. Marcus and I returned to our regular patrol routine the following week. But for a long time after that night, whenever I drove past the reservoir or looked out at the dense woods of District 4 during the quiet hours of the graveyard shift, I couldn't help but look at those dark, forgotten corners a little differently. You realize just how close the darkness is, sitting right at the end of a routine road, waiting for someone to turn the lights out.